I go back to Barna research and how they talk about the perspective of the generation and their families of what they think of the church, and they think of us as being irrelevant, untrustworthy, and not worthy of belief. So as I was thinking through those three, I was thinking, how do we counteract that? How do we become more relevant, more trustworthy, and worthy of belief again?
Welcome to Cross-Formed Kidmin, where we equip you to raise up the next generation of lifelong Christ followers. Even with our 60 years of children's ministry experience, we still have more questions than answers, but we're convinced of one thing: building a fruitful children's ministry is always a miracle, but it's never an accident.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Cross-Formed Kidmin podcast. We are so thankful that you're listening. I've got Sam with me and Ryan as always, and we have with us a very special guest. Janine McNally is joining us, and she's part of our Kidmin Seminary. If you remember, we introduced this series, and it came out of the idea of what would it look like if we had a seminary for children's ministry leaders. So we thought of topics and people we want to invite on the show, and Janine instantly came to mind. So we're glad that she's here. If you don't know Janine, Janine was a high school teacher in Australia, and you'll pick up on that accent as we get into the conversation. She's the founder and director of Grace for Kids, a nonprofit that produces gospel-centered resources. In her spare time, she's a writer, professor, and doctoral student, and has just published her first book, When You See Fireflies, Equipping Parents and Leaders to Minister Effectively to Generation Alpha. She's been involved for over 40 years in ministry alongside her husband, and most recently, this primary folk ministry. She passionately believes in empowering leaders and parents to reach Generation Alpha for Christ. So, Janine, welcome to the Cross-Formed Kidmin podcast.
Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, we're super thankful to have you. And so, like we said, we're doing this Kidmin Seminary, and we thought it'd be great to have you on to kind of do, I guess you could say, a class or a session on cultural research and studies, but specifically with your expertise in Generation Alpha, we thought it'd be great to have you on to share your research you've done on Gen Alpha. As I mentioned in that intro, you have a new book coming out called When You See Fireflies that's all about how to minister to Gen Alpha. So I'm really excited to dig into that. But before we get into that specific research, one thing I wanted to ask you kind of at the top is, why do you believe research on specific generations is so important? You know, some people say, just do ministry. We don't need to get into all that. But why is research like this on culture and the kids we're serving so important?
Well, so you know Valerie Bell, right? She's the Awana, way up there, big name. She wrote a book called Resilient, which I know you know, and she says in her book there, I fear our assumptions of sameness, our cluelessness in the midst of huge cultural shifts may lead us to be unresponsive to the needs that these shifts present. And that's exactly why I think we need to do it. Our kids are a moving target. What they were like 10 years ago is not the same as what they are now, and we need to be constantly readjusting to accommodate them. I know in my book I tell a story about how my husband was a hunter growing up, and he wanted to teach me how to shoot. And we went out and had some practice shots at a target, and I was pretty good considering that I was an amateur. But then he brought out the clay pigeon shooting, and I don't know if you guys know about this, but the clay shooter will shoot a round target, a clay target up in the air, which is supposed to simulate a live bird or a turkey or whatever. And once that thing went off, I did not hit a single target. So when the target is moving, it's much harder to try to constantly be adjusting for these kids. But that's why I think it's important. And it's really hard, I think, with kids ministry because they're so busy already. Who has time to stop and evaluate whether or not these kids have changed? So that's kind of why I wrote the book.
That's such a gift to the church. You know, I think about what you said with the Resilient book and other research groups like Barna. I think they're gifts to the church because they can give us specificity on what kids are assuming, what they're going through, what common beliefs they have. And it's not like that changes the gospel message by any means, but it can give us clarity on, you know, what kids may have known going into the church 10 years ago is not what they know going in now. questions they have might be different types of questions. And so, yeah, I think works like yours and others are gifts to the church. They really do help us get more locked on to that moving target. That's a really good analogy.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Janine, as you've studied this, what are the major trends or characteristics that you've found that define Generation Alpha?
Oh, well, the obvious that they were born into a world of technology. I asked my oldest kids, when did you get your first technology device? And for the two oldest, they said it was when we were in college and we needed it for school. Our youngest got a phone when she was probably 13 or 14. But the kids today, they're born into iPads and iPhones. We were at a restaurant the other day, and you know the kids' menus, how they have on the backside, they'll often have a coloring sheet and they'll hand out crayons. Well, this restaurant did that, and they were pushed to the side, and the two little girls were playing on iPads. That is very typical. The year 2010, when this generation supposedly began, that was the year of the iPad when they were created. So it's kind of ironic that they are known as they're known as Generation Glass because of their devices. But yeah, the VBS I helped with last year, there was an 8-year-old. She was walking around quite proudly. She had an iPhone. And I'm thinking, what 8-year-old needs an iPhone? Why did they? I don't know. Why do they need that? But they have it. So that definitely makes them unique in that respect. They're never going to make a phone call on a rotary phone or send a fax. That's all gone. Another thing that's really significant, I think, for them is COVID-19, obviously. They're known as COVID babies. So when you take little kids and you throw a face mask on them and you isolate them to their home and they can't visit their grandma and grandpa or their friends, that's going to have an effect on them. And the experts say the younger you are when that defining moment takes place, it's going to be a more significant event in your life. And I don't think we've come close to seeing the impact that COVID is going to have on these kids. So between the two, as a parent and a teacher, I see these kids with iPads and I want to slap them out of their hands, but it would be naive to think that we can remove technology from their lives. And when you think about it, what happened during COVID? You know, their classrooms were replaced by what? A device, some kind of a laptop where they could do their classes. And their mums were busy trying to stay home, trying to work from home, and the devices became their childcare. So back then, it was the solution to life. So there's good and bad with technology.
Yeah. You know, coming from Australia, you know, it's a different culture, different context and stuff. How universal do you think that problem is? Is it the same everywhere, or do you feel like it's more pronounced in the United States? Or what have you seen from different contexts that you've been involved in?
Sure. The guy who actually came up with the name Generation Alpha, his name is Mark McCrindle, and he's an Australian. He's a social research analyst in Australia. He was the first one. I actually read Generation Alpha in a footnote while I was doing some research for the classes I was about to teach. And the footnote was to an article, believe it or not, written by a psychology professor at a university in India. I don't know how or why he was writing that, but that's when I first heard about it. So I looked into it and I contacted Mark McCrindle and I said, do you think that the results of the surveys you've been doing would apply to Americans in the same way as Australians? He said, absolutely. And he is a Christian guy. And I said, have you done any study at all on the effect of technology and all of that stuff in terms of kids ministry? And he said, no, we haven't done anything with churches. And that's when I started writing my book. I thought that's what we got to do, because no one's writing about them. They're still talking about Gen Z.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So you're talking about in your book about the practical aspects of technology and how that affects the next generation and how we're supposed to reach them in the church, which I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some practical changes and next steps that we need to take place in our ministry for us to have effective ministry to take place? Like, what are some things? Like, do we need more technology? Do we need less technology? Do we need more focused technology? Like, what do you think is best to reach this next generation?
Well, that is a great question. I really think that during COVID, I think the churches just embraced technology, obviously, because we had to. But you've probably heard that Generation Z, the one before Alphas, labeled as the most anxious generation, even though their connection, so-called connection with social media, they are the loneliest generation and the most anxious generation. And the kids that are growing up now, they're going to have access to the same technology. And I think probably in churches, we almost need to cut back a little on it because, did you hear of Zoom fatigue during COVID? We would be always on Zoom and the kids were just sick of it. They just wanted to get outside and play. So I think we need a balance, definitely. I think if we continue to put a CD in a CD player, the kids will roll their eyes, and even DVDs are going out now. They do want to be impressed, but I think it's impossible to impress them like Disney. We just can't. But we can impress them with our love, and I think we need to balance technology with relationships and conversation too. We need to be answering their questions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is to try to wow kids with technology to the point that we starve them relationally. And
yes.
That is a massive mistake I think that we make with every generation, I think, because we think progress. We think every new idea is a good idea.
Yeah.
Instead of filtering that idea through the Word of God, instead of asking ourselves, is it good, not is it helpful, but is it true? And
right.
having, I think we as Christians should have a different standard for how we decide things and filter things, So, no, I think that's great. So, what are some practical changes we need to make? You said more relationship. Is there any other things that you can think of that are more practical changes we need to make to reach this generation to help, I guess, assuage some of that anxiety that you're referring to?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe you should buy my book and you can read all the
there you
all
go.
the ideas in there. Touche.
There you go. Nice. Well done.
Well, I go back to Barna research and how they talk about the perspective of the generation and their families of what they think of the church, and they think of us as being irrelevant, untrustworthy, and not worthy of belief. So as I was thinking through those three, I was thinking, how do we counteract that? How do we become more relevant, more trustworthy, and worthy of belief again? In terms of relevance, we need to be answering their questions. The world is aggressively teaching their secular worldview, and we're teaching nice Bible stories which neither address their hurt nor discuss the solutions to them. So, we teach Noah's Ark over and over again, but do we talk about how Noah must have felt with a town staring at him and laughing and mocking him, maybe even bullying him, and relating that to bullying in today's life? Or Esther, when she was standing up to the king and risking her life to do the right thing. We can bring those stories into real life and apply them and allow the kids to think through, how do we handle these situations from a biblical perspective? And I don't think we're answering those questions. They need real life application, and I don't think they're getting it. In terms of trust, the old one, the church is full of hypocrites, they're still saying that. They're sick of seeing the politics and the moral failures and the splits in churches. And they're like, why should I bother becoming part of a group that preaches one thing and says another or does another? And we need to be living out our faith. Millennial parents, who are the parents primarily of Generation Alpha, they prioritize safety and security. And I think we're doing pretty well on that one. Most churches, I think, have security systems in place now for their kids. But I think we need to think through, how do we live out our faith more? This generation coming up cares for the down and out a lot. They care for poor people. And if we're ignoring our community, I think that reeks of hypocrisy to them. So I think we need to be more unified and more true to our faith in our behavior. And then in terms of belief, we mentioned this a second ago, relativism is just everywhere, and there is no longer a universal code of belief. There's no right and wrong. There's no black and white. It's all gray. If it's, it might be right for you to believe, but it's not right for me. And I think we've got to target in on that. And one thing I talk about in my book is helping kids experience God for themselves. So taking the head knowledge, moving it the 12 inches down to the heart. And I tell a story of our youngest, Jamie. She was about 13 or 14, and we were about to begin a brand new midweek program at our church. And we had divided the concept into 4 age groups: younger boys, younger girls, older girls. And she was helping out with the older girl class. And she said, "Mom, I'm going to pray for 9 older girls to come to our class." And I'm thinking, math teacher, 36 kids. Whoa, I don't think so. I'm thinking we'll be lucky to get 20. And so I was at this, what do I do? Do I tell her, don't pray? or pray for less? What do I do? So I said, that's great, sweetie. Go ahead, pray. And during the week leading up, she was up to 5 kids in the group, and I was thrilled. She was not happy. She just kept on. She said, I'm going to keep praying, Mom. I'm like, okay, sweetie, you keep praying. And the night, we were 30 minutes before starting, and she had 7 kids in her group. And I'm like, way to go, Jane. Those prayers are working. And she said, Mom, she was downtrodden. She was very upset. And I said, it'll be okay, And then my phone rang, and it was a mother from the community who said, is it too late to bring my 2 kids? And I said, no, you can come, sure. I said, would you mind me asking how old they are? And she said, oh, it's 2 girls, 4th and 5th grade. And I'm like, that made 9. And Jamie's prayers were answered, and she will never forget that when she prayed and she saw God work for herself. That was not Mom and Dad and their beliefs. That I really helped move that from her brain down to her heart. And if you saw her today and you asked her, that's what would stand out. So somehow we need to translate that, whether it be when we ask kids for prayer requests, actually have a book there and write them out and follow and track their prayer requests and show them that God answers prayer.
Wow, that's really good.
So yeah,
that's great.
Hey friends, it's Ryan. Listen, I want to ask you, are you ready to take your children's ministry beyond effectiveness into fruitfulness? If so, CrossForm Kids may be exactly what you're looking for. I'd love for you to reach out at the link in our show notes, and we'll get back to you with a custom quote for your ministry. I want to ask about something specific that you said, Janine. You mentioned that kids need to experience more application, like real life application of what they're learning, and that you don't think they're getting it. And I found that interesting because in my experience, like most churches are teaching almost exclusively application. Like they rarely offer exegesis or real teaching of the Bible, but instead lean on application or life application lessons. So I'm curious, like exactly like what, I think there must be a certain kind of application that you're thinking of that kids are not getting. And I'd love to hear more about what specifically that is that you want them to get more of.
Sure. Well, I think I agree with you. Churches are definitely like that, but I think that's the adult, the big church. I think you go into the kids' church and the curriculums are still very much focused on going through the Bible or topic or whatever, but I'm talking about the issues they're facing now, not so much necessarily peer pressure, but bullying, not so much the rights or wrongs of drinking alcohol, but fentanyl overdoses. What do we do with school shootings? Although the things that they're facing today, gender differences, what do you do when your 3rd grader comes home and says, the boy, he's wearing a dress? I've got 2 dads. I'm being raised by my 2 dads. I don't know if you've seen the TV show. What's it called? It's The Parent Trap or something like that. They've got 12 sets of parents, all have a different philosophy of raising their kids, and they're evaluating the effectiveness to find America's most effective parenting style. And so they give them challenges and then they evaluate and people get eliminated. Well, there are a couple of gay guys who are parents to a couple of boys, and then there's a single homosexual guy that's raising a boy on his own. What do you do in those situations? What do you say to the kids? If those kids are in your church or if your kids know those kids, I think we need to be dealing with those questions in the children's department, not just out in big church. So that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking primarily with the preteen age group. So If you do look at a scan of a child's brain at preschool, and then you look at a scan of a child's brain at their preteen years, like 11 or 12, the scans will look very much the same. They're both going into a significant time of change and development. Preschool go into elementary school. Preteens are making their way towards adulthood, and their brains become malleable again and open. And they talk about it, they say it's cognitive pruning. They begin to prune out things from their life that they don't feel will be helpful. And they cut things, that's not going to be good. I don't care about that. Cut that out, cut. And we have to figure out, how do we stop them from cutting God out? They're changing from concrete to abstract thinking. So now they're starting to ask questions in a completely different way, and we need to take that opportunity when they're malleable again and maybe they're most receptive. That may be the best time to teach and impact kids or people, is at that preteen, 4th, 5th grade age group. That was something I learned as I was doing research, and I didn't know about that, but that's what I'm talking about. At that stage, when they're asking those questions, instead of having somebody doing a monologue up front in the teaching of their Sunday school class, turn them into circles and throw out an issue and let them talk, let them ask questions and have answers for them from the Bible.
Yeah, that's helpful and clarifying.
I'd add to that, Ryan. I think what you said earlier too is super helpful. One of the things I really appreciate Janine said is like, when you're teaching the story of Noah's Ark, just don't talk about a floating zoo.
Right.
Talk about a world hostile to those who are walking in obedience to God's commands.
Exactly.
And the problem is not so much that curriculums don't talk about the Bible, the problem is that they cut out the wrong things.
Yes.
And they oversimplify. And what they do oftentimes is they make the story so simple that they take out the hard parts, and the hard parts are the parts that help you when in life when it's really hard.
Yeah.
Like we cannot be afraid as leaders who lead kids to teach the hard parts of the Bible. We can't back away from that. We can't back away from that because it undergirds what people are afraid of is, I think oftentimes they're afraid of, well, like that might undercut the legitimacy of the Bible to kids because these are hard things. And we live in a world that is filled with hard things.
Oh, yeah.
And it actually adds legitimacy. And so I appreciate that you brought that up.
And if we don't answer their questions, you know what they're going to do? Google.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to Google.
They're not going to be good answers.
No, and they don't even have to know how to type anymore, because you can just say, Alexa, what is blank? You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Fill in the blank with your worst dream.
That piece you gave about how their brains become flexible again into where they can say, oh, this is meaningful to me, so I'm going to keep that, or this isn't having any impact, so that's going to get tossed. I think that's a helpful framework, because I think a lot of times the reason, when kids get into high school or when they graduate high school, they say, I don't know about church or whatever, is I think part of it is we presented them a view of God that's very small. I think about this all the time, of how, like, instead of presenting God as the great lion that he is, we present him as a domestic cat that can't deal with the hardships of life we face. Yeah, and I think what you're saying is so good. The application we need to give them shouldn't be just sweet sugar. It needs to be, this is what you need. This is what you're facing. We're answering questions they're not even asking. They're dealing with school shootings, suicides, sexual identity. They're dealing with all this stuff. And we, as Christ followers, need to be willing to talk about those things.
Yeah, well, a lot of our teachers, I think, again, this is Barna. I think it was Barna's research, but they said that these are the topics that the teachers feel most uncomfortable talking about, because they don't know, should I do this? Will the parents be okay if I talk about this? Or should this be done one-on-one? So we have to address them and give them freedom to talk about whatever we feel they should be talking about.
Yeah, and I think a little wisdom for this part too is I have heard that where some teachers will say, well, this isn't my place to bring this up. That needs to be the parents' job. Well, there's a thing called collaboration, where children's ministry leaders and parents can work together on this.
Yep.
Maybe a part of the Bible story you teach is going to bring up something really difficult. Go ahead and just let parents know and give them resources to prep them to have those conversations at home. I don't know why we do this thing where we pit children's ministry and parents against each other, or I don't know. There has to be this collaboration. Because if we really care for the souls of our kids, we're going to work hard at it.
Yep.
Right? We have to get over that the hardest thing in kids ministry is planning the activity. No, the hard work of kids ministry is developing souls who are formed into the image of Christ. That's what matters. And so that's what I love about what you're saying, Janine. And you've already referenced it a couple of times, but I really want to make sure listeners get information on it. I would love for you to share just a little bit about your book, where the title came from. It has a really unique title. So about the book, the title, when it's coming out, and all that stuff. I'd love for you to share that.
Sure. Well, I was prepping for my classes that I'm about to teach, and I thought, I had 16 hours of lectures. I thought I'll just turn that into a book. That's what everybody does, right? And so I started breaking it into chapters. And as I was doing that, I thought this is going to be really boring because everybody has already written about all this stuff. So I was just reading, and that's when I came across that footnote from the guy in India about Generation Alpha. And that's what I'm like, that's what I'm doing. I got to do that. So I changed my plan and started fixing what I had done before. And I was like, what will I call this thing? And I had been reading about, book titles are really, really important, and you shouldn't have anything cryptic. And so I'm thinking, leading Generation Alpha or, equipping, I don't know. I was in that process of trying to think. And my daughter, our oldest daughter, who just gave us twin boy grandbabies, our favorite alphas on the planet right now, she was the one that said, Mom, you need to call your book When You See Fireflies. And I'm like, okay, how come? And she said, well, remember when we were in Pennsylvania, we lived on 2.5 acres of land surrounded by farmland, and the back of our lot was sort of marshy. It was kind of wet. And so it brought out fireflies everywhere in the summer. And the two of them, our son and daughter, would say, can we go out and play? Sure, go ahead. What time do we need to come in when you see the fireflies? She's like, that's perfect, because we didn't have a watch. We didn't have a phone. There was no other indication, and we were completely enthralled with playing in the backyard. But when the darkness comes, it's time to come inside because there's dangers at night. And the fireflies were the indicator. Come on in. They only show their lights, flash their lights for a little while, so it's urgent. So that's where it came from. It's when you see the fireflies, come on in from the dark to the light, the only one who has the answers to all of the questions in this dark world. So yeah, that's where it came from.
And Janine, of course, we want everybody to read it, but who is just like the perfect ideal audience for the book? Like children's ministry leaders, parents, teachers, who were you thinking of when you wrote it?
Yeah, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Senior pastors, anybody who has anything to do with that age group, 0 to 13 right now, because we can't reach them if we don't understand them. I've already started working on my next book, and it's going to be on parenting Generation Alpha. That will be specifically for parents, and I'm planning on having it not just Christian parents, so that I can hopefully throw the gospel in everything. So hopefully that will be a way to potentially reach them. But there are a number of chapters on parents in this one and leaders, but my prime audience would be probably kids ministry leaders.
Well, good stuff, Janine. I want to thank you so much for doing this. You were a perfect professor to have for the Kidmin Seminary. This was so good. I learned a lot, was really inspired and encouraged to reach our next generation in ways, like you said, they're moving targets, and you've given us just a little more ways to lock in to this generation and reach them for Christ. So, Janine, thank you so much for coming on the Crossform Kidmin podcast.
You betcha. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Crossform Kidmin podcast, brought to you by Crossform Kids. Check out the show notes for any resources we mentioned in the episode. You can also submit any questions or topics you would like for us to cover in future episodes on the form linked in the show notes. And if you have a few seconds, please leave us a review. Thank you again for listening to the Crossform Kidmin podcast.